My husband abandoned our family, and I didn't hear from him again until he landed himself in jail. And after receiving dozens of threats, I bailed him out. In return, he ruined my life. I thought being a single mom would suck until I fell in love with my son. When my son was just 5, his dad abandoned us. I woke up one day and he was just gone. No text, no call, no conversation. Luckily, he was a deadbeat, so the difference between his presence and his absence was actually close to 0. I was still the sole earner of the household. My main concern was my son. He was one of those kids who thought his dad was some undefeatable superhero. Plus, growing up, I had a lot of friends who were part of single-parent families. And, well, most of them turned out really funky, if you catch my drift. But it really seemed like my son was different. When I told him his dad left to go to work for Santa Claus, he nodded and said, "That's okay, mommy. I know with you I can do anything anyway." My heart melted, and I knew I had given birth to an angel. From then on, me and my son became best friends. One time, for his 7th birthday, I couldn't afford to host a birthday party for him. So instead, he hosted his own. He invited everyone from his class to the park, and one of his friends brought a cake. After he blew out the candles, he pulled me aside and asked, "Mommy, do you feel sad?" "No, honey. Why do you ask that?" He scrunched up his face like he was thinking super hard and said, "Because we didn't do anything for your birthday, and all these people are here for mine." I just lifted him up and twirled him around. I assured him it was his day, and he deserved to be celebrated without worrying about me. He just shrugged his shoulders and ran back to his friends, and he should have been enough for me, but he wasn't. One night at 3 a.m., I found myself clutching his dad's, my ex-husband's, old hoodie, and I thought about how it felt to have someone's arms around me at night, to know someone has your back, no matter what, to have someone to lean on. Usually I try to stifle the tears and blink them away, but since it was dark and I was alone, I thought it was safe to let myself cry. So I cried. A lot. I could feel my face throbbing from how hard the tears were coming out, and apparently, I woke up my son. Except I didn't realize it until he came in and asked if everything was okay. I immediately plastered on a huge smile and told him I had just finished watching The Lion King and was thinking about Mufasa's death. I assumed he had bought it, because he immediately nodded and trotted back to bed. But the next morning, I woke up to the smell of burnt toast. I went downstairs and saw my son had tried to make me breakfast. My plate was loaded with strawberries, charcoal black toast, and some raw spaghetti noodles, his favorite snack. He told me there was no reason to be sad, because he loved me. I hugged him until he couldn't breathe. I knew he was the love of my life, my beautiful son. And as I sat down eating the charcoal toast with a smile, I got the text. It was a photo from an unknown number. The text was a link from the county sheriff's website. His dad had been arrested. I wasn't even surprised. I knew it was probably for substances. But when I read the charge, my eyes literally popped out of my head. Authorities had found content on his computer, and whoever was texting me wanted me to pay bail. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Jamie was chattering away about his plans for the day, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just exploded in my world. The text was from an unknown number, but it had to be someone who knew Mark and me. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was reading. My stomach churned and I nearly vomited right there at the kitchen table. My first instinct was to block the number and pretend I never saw it. Mark was out of our lives, and he deserved to rot in jail for what he'd done. I deleted the text and tried to focus on Jamie, who was now explaining the intricate rules of a game he'd invented. Jamie had always been creative like that. He could literally turn a pile of rocks and some sticks into an entire imaginary world, with complicated social structures and everything. His teacher even mentioned it during our last parent-teacher conference, saying he had an extraordinary imagination. An hour later, another text came through. "This is Richard, Mark's friend. He needs $15,000 for bail. He said you'd help." I nearly laughed out loud. $15,000? I could barely afford our rent. The audacity of these people. Like, seriously, I was eating ramen 3 nights a week and buying Jamie's clothes from thrift stores just to make ends meet. There were nights I'd skip dinner altogether just so Jamie could have seconds if he wanted them. Not that I ever let him know that. I'd just say I wasn't hungry or had a big lunch. And even if I had the money, why would I spend it on the man who abandoned his family and had now been arrested for something so horrific? I blocked that number too, and took Jamie to the park, determined to push the whole thing out of my mind. The weather was perfect, and watching Jamie race around with other kids almost made me forget about the morning's disturbing messages. Almost. He had this way of completely throwing himself into whatever he was doing. Full throttle, no reservations. That day he spent almost an hour just collecting different colored leaves, categorizing them by shape and size. It was adorable and exactly what I needed to distract me. When we got home, there was a note taped to our door. My hands shook as I pulled it off and read it. "We need to talk about Mark. Call me, Richard." And there was a phone number. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash as soon as we got inside. I didn't know any Richard, and I certainly wasn't going to help Mark. That night, after Jamie was asleep, I Googled Mark's charges. The local news had a small article about it. It was real. My ex-husband, the father of my child, was in jail for having pictures of children on his computer. I felt sick and couldn't sleep. I just kept tossing and turning, thinking about all the signs I might have missed. We had been together for almost 8 years total, married for 6 of them. How could I not have known? Had there been clues I'd ignored? Was Jamie safe during those years? These questions circled in my head like vultures, making me physically nauseous. I must have finally fallen asleep around 4 a.m., but woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The next morning, I had 3 missed calls from the same number Richard had left. I was getting ready to block it when a text came through that made my blood run cold. "I know you're ignoring me. I'm your landlord's nephew. Uncle Greg wants to help Mark too. Don't make this difficult." I dropped my phone. Our landlord was Greg Mercer, a well-connected businessman who owned half the properties in our small town. I'd met him exactly twice, when signing the lease and when he came to fix a leaky pipe. He'd seemed nice enough, but distant. I never knew he had any connection to Mark. I called the number with shaking hands. "Hello, Melissa. Finally, a smooth voice answered. It was Richard Mercer. He explained that he and Mark had been friends since college, and that Greg had rented to us as a favor to Mark. Richard insisted that there was a misunderstanding about Mark's charges, that someone had hacked his computer or set him up. I didn't believe a word of it. When I told him I couldn't afford bail even if I wanted to help, his voice turned cold. That's disappointing. Uncle Greg was really hoping you'd be more cooperative. He might have to rethink your living situation. The threat was clear. I hung up and immediately started to panic. We couldn't afford to move, and finding another affordable place in town would be nearly impossible with Greg Mercer controlling so much of the rental market. Our apartment wasn't fancy by any means. The carpet was at least 10 years old, the appliances were outdated, and the bathroom sink had this weird gurgling sound whenever you used it. But it was ours. Jamie's school was just 3 blocks away, and my job was a 15-minute bus ride. We had built a life here, created routines and memories in this space. I called in sick to my job at the dental office and spent the day researching tenant rights while Jamie was at school. I found myself going down internet rabbit holes about eviction laws and tenant protections, printing out pages from legal aid websites and highlighting sections that might help us. My coworker Tina texted to check if I was okay, and I lied and said I had a stomach bug. Tina and I weren't super close or anything, but she was always nice to me and often covered my shifts when Jamie had school events. She was one of those women who seemed to have everything together: perfect hair, coordinated outfits, a husband who brought her lunch sometimes. I always felt a little shabby next to her, but she never made me feel bad about it. The next day, Richard was waiting outside my workplace when I finished my shift. He was leaning against a shiny black car, looking like he owned the world. I tried to walk past him, but he stepped in front of me. "Uncle Greg's willing to front the bail money," he said smoothly. "You can pay him back monthly." I shook my head and tried to step around him. "Mark is not my problem anymore." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "He's Jamie's father, and Uncle Greg is your landlord. I'd say that makes Mark very much your problem." I walked away without answering, my heart pounding. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my key into my car door. I sat in the driver's seat for a good 5 minutes just trying to calm down enough to drive. A million thoughts ran through my head, from packing up and leaving town in the middle of the night to calling the police about Richard's harassment. But I had nowhere to go, no family nearby to help, and barely enough savings to cover next month's rent, let alone fund a big move. That evening, Greg Mercer himself called me. His voice was friendly but firm as he explained that he considered Mark like family and wanted to help him through this unfortunate misunderstanding. When I remained non-committal, his tone changed. "Your lease is coming up for renewal soon, isn't it? Rents are going up all over town. It's a shame, with a young boy to raise." I was shaking by the time I hung up. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. That night, I sat at our tiny kitchen table after Jamie was asleep, trying to figure out our options. I even looked up homeless shelters in neighboring counties just in case. The thought of Jamie having to live in a shelter broke me, and I ended up crying silently into a dish towel so he wouldn't hear me. A week went by with daily texts from Richard and occasional friendly check-ins from Greg. I was a nervous wreck. I started losing weight because I could barely eat, and dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. I was constantly jumping at small noises and checking over my shoulder. I started taking different routes home from work, paranoid that Richard might be following me. Jamie noticed something was wrong. He's always been perceptive like that, and kept asking if I was sick. I told him I was just tired from work, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. Then Jamie came home from school one day and asked me when Daddy was coming back from working for Santa. My heart broke all over again. "Why are you asking about Daddy, sweetie?" Jamie shrugged. "Tyler at school said his mom saw Daddy's picture in the newspaper, so he can't be at the North Pole." I had no idea how to respond. I mumbled something about Tyler being confused and quickly changed the subject, but Jamie kept bringing up Mark over the next few days. It was like suddenly, after 2 years, he was really missing his father. Kids at school can be so cruel without even realizing it. I wondered what exactly Tyler had said, and if the other kids were teasing Jamie about it. It would be just like Jamie to internalize that and not tell me because he wouldn't want me to worry. The pressure kept building. Richard showed up at our apartment unannounced one evening, acting overly friendly with Jamie, bringing him a toy car that he couldn't take his eyes off. It was a detailed model of a vintage Mustang, the kind of thing Mark used to talk about buying someday. Jamie was instantly obsessed with it, making vroom vroom noises and racing it across the coffee table. While Jamie played, Richard told me in hushed tones that Mark's trial date was approaching, and without bail, he'd stay in jail until then. "What kind of mother keeps a child from his father?" he asked with fake concern. I wanted to scream that a father who looks at pictures of children doesn't deserve to see his son, but Jamie was right there, happily zooming his new car around the living room. After Richard left, I noticed Jamie playing with the car for hours, even taking it to bed with him. It broke my heart that such a simple toy could mean so much to him. It was a stark reminder of how much he missed having a father figure in his life. The next blow came when Tina pulled me aside at work. "The office manager got a weird call yesterday," she whispered. "Someone claiming you have an unstable home situation and shouldn't be working with patients. What's going on?" I felt like I couldn't breathe. They were trying to get me fired now. My job at the dental office wasn't glamorous. I scheduled appointments, filed insurance claims, and sometimes helped sterilize equipment, but it paid the bills and had decent health insurance for Jamie. The thought of losing it was terrifying. I made it through my shift somehow and called my parents that night, breaking down as I explained the situation. They lived on a fixed income in a one-bedroom condo in Florida, so staying with them wasn't an option. My dad insisted on sending me what little he could spare, but it was nowhere near enough for bail or even for a security deposit on a new place. I felt guilty even telling them about it, knowing they would worry and try to help despite their own financial struggles. My mom had health issues that required expensive medications, and they were already pinching pennies to make ends meet. The pressure intensified when Greg Mercer sent an official letter stating that my rent would double upon renewal due to market conditions. I couldn't afford that. He knew it. I knew it. it. The letter looked so official and formal, with legal language about market value adjustments and standard rate increases, but I knew it was just another form of bullying. I started looking for second jobs, desperate for any solution that didn't involve helping Mark. I applied to be a night stalker at the local grocery store, a weekend receptionist at a hair salon, and even considered driving for a food delivery app, though my car was so old I wasn't sure it would qualify. I was running on fumes, surviving on coffee and whatever I could grab from the office vending machine. One night, after a particularly stressful day where Richard had coincidentally run into Jamie and me at the grocery store, making a point to talk about how sad Mark was in jail, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Mark himself calling from jail. His voice was the same as I remembered, but with a pathetic, whiny edge to it. "Mel, you gotta help me," he pleaded. "They've got it all wrong. I would never, I wouldn't. Think of Jamie." I hung up without saying a word, but the calls kept coming from different jail phones. I blocked each number, but he always found another way to call. It felt like I was being stalked from inside a jail cell. The whole thing was so surreal. I started avoiding checking my phone at all, which just made me more anxious about missing calls from Jamie's school or my boss. One night, Richard escalated his threats. He cornered me in the parking lot after work and spoke very clearly. "Uncle Greg has connections with CPS, you know. It would be a shame if someone reported concerns about Jamie's home environment." I nearly collapsed with fear. They were threatening to take my child now. The thought of Jamie being taken away from me was more than I could bear. I went home and cried all night, trying not to wake Jamie. I pictured him confused and scared in some stranger's home, wondering why his mom didn't come for him. By morning, I was desperate and defeated. The next morning, I called Richard and told him I'd help with bail. He showed up at my apartment an hour later with papers for me to sign, a loan agreement with Greg Mercer, with my apartment as collateral. The interest was criminal, but I had no choice. I signed, and Richard smiled like he'd won the lottery. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Mark will be out tomorrow." I spent that night throwing up from stress and fear. How would I keep Mark away from Jamie once he was out? The bail conditions required him to stay in town, and with the Mercers backing him, I felt completely trapped. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. I felt like I was signing a deal with the devil, and the cost would be more than just money. Mark showed up at our door 3 days later, looking thin and twitchy. I refused to let him in, speaking to him through the chain lock. He started crying, insisting he was innocent, that someone had planted the files on his computer. I told him the bail was a loan I had to repay, and that he wasn't welcome in our home. He left eventually, but I knew it wasn't over. Jamie spotted him from the window and asked a million questions about why Daddy was outside but didn't come in. I made up some story about Daddy being sick and needing to get better before he could visit. The lies were piling up and I was drowning in them. I hated lying to Jamie, but how do you explain something like this to a 7-year-old? I tried to distract him with a new Lego set I'd been saving for his half-birthday, but he kept glancing at the window like he expected Mark to reappear. For the next 2 weeks, Mark called constantly and showed up unannounced. Richard and Greg kept pressuring me to let Mark see Jamie, suggesting that if I didn't, they might have to reconsider our arrangement. I was between a rock and a hard place. I felt like I was barely treading water, just trying to keep Jamie's life as normal as possible while everything around us was falling apart. I started experiencing anxiety attacks. My heart would race, my hands would shake, and sometimes I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. I was afraid to go to sleep, afraid to go to work, afraid to let Jamie out of my sight. Eventually, I agreed to supervised visits at a public park. The first one was awkward and tense. Jamie was shy at first, then gradually warmed up as Mark showered him with attention and promises about all the things they'd do together. I sat on a bench nearby, never taking my eyes off them, feeling sick the entire time. Mark brought Jamie a remote-controlled car and showed him how to use it. Jamie was delighted, racing it around the playground while Mark cheered him on. To anyone watching, we probably looked like a normal family enjoying a day at the park, but I felt like I was performing in some horrible play, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. After the visit, Mark started pushing for more. Unsupervised time, overnight visits. I refused, and the threats from Richard ramped up again. He started showing up at my workplace almost daily, always with that same smug smile, always with a new threat or demand. My boss started giving me concerned looks, clearly wondering about this man who kept asking for me but never made an appointment. I was afraid I'd lose my job, afraid I'd lose my apartment, afraid I'd lose Jamie. One evening, I came home from work to find Jamie playing happily with Mark in our living room. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who sometimes watched Jamie after school, explained that Mark had shown up claiming I'd asked him to pick Jamie up. I was furious and terrified. Mrs. Chen was apologetic, explaining that Jamie had seemed so happy to see his father that she assumed it was arranged. She didn't know the whole story. How could she? I'd been too ashamed and scared to tell anyone what was really going on. I waited until Jamie was in bed, then confronted Mark, who had refused to leave. "You can't just come into my home without permission," I hissed. Mark's face changed, the mask of the doting father slipping to reveal something cold and calculating. "It's not just your home," he said. "Richard told me about your arrangement with Greg. You're on thin ice, Mel. One word from me, and you're both out on the street." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking that the doors and windows were locked, afraid of what Mark might do. I even pushed the couch in front of the door, an old habit from when Mark used to come home drunk and angry in the early days of our marriage, before Jamie was born. Those memories came flooding back, the walking on eggshells, the unpredictable mood swings, the way he could go from charming to menacing in an instant. I'd worked so hard to forget that version of Mark, to only remember the decent moments for Jamie's sake. But now I was forced to confront the truth. Mark had always been dangerous. The next day, I called a domestic violence hotline and explained my situation. They suggested applying for an emergency restraining order based on Mark's threats and unauthorized entry. I took a day off work and went to the courthouse with all the threatening texts from Richard, and a detailed account of what had happened. The clerk was sympathetic but explained that without evidence of physical violence, it might be hard to get the order granted right away. I left feeling defeated. I felt like I was screaming for help, but no one was listening. The legal system seemed designed to protect people like Mark and the Mercers, people with connections and resources, not single moms like me who were just trying to keep their kids safe. That night, Mark called and said he was coming over to see Jamie. I told him no, that I was pursuing legal options to keep him away. He laughed. Good luck with that when you're homeless and unemployed. An hour later, someone started pounding on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Mark, obviously drunk or high, swaying in the hallway. I told him to leave or I'd call the police. The pounding got louder. Mrs. Chen opened her door across the hall and threatened to call security. Mark started yelling obscenities at her. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. Jamie woke up and came out of his room, rubbing his eyes sleepily. When he heard his father's voice, he ran toward the door. I had to physically hold him back, which made him cry. Mark heard Jamie's cries and started yelling that I was keeping his son from him, that I was an unfit mother. The whole scene was like something from a nightmare. The police took forever to arrive. By then, Mark had kicked my door so hard the frame was splintering. When the officers finally showed up, they arrested Mark for disturbing the peace and property damage. I immediately went back to the courthouse the next day and was granted a temporary restraining order. I showed the judge photos of the damaged door and played a recording I'd made on my phone of Mark's threats. The judge looked grim as he signed the order, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like someone in authority actually believed me. I thought it would give us some breathing room, but I underestimated Richard's determination. He showed up at my workplace the next day, cornering me in the break room. "You've made a big mistake," he said quietly. "Uncle Greg is very disappointed. He's talking to the building manager about violations in your unit." I stood my ground and told him about the restraining order, warning that if he kept harassing me, I'd report him too. He just smiled. Restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They don't stop anything. That night, someone slashed my car tires. The next day, my boss called me into his office to discuss concerns about my performance that had never been mentioned before. Jamie came home from school upset because a man had approached him at recess, telling him his mom was keeping his daddy away because she was a bad person. It was Richard. I called the police, but they said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I was at my breaking point. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and jumped at every sound. Jamie began having nightmares and wetting the bed, something he hadn't done since he was 4. I felt like I was failing him, like I couldn't protect him from all this ugliness. I began to wonder if we should just leave everything behind and disappear. My coworker Tina noticed how ragged I looked and insisted on buying me lunch. Over sandwiches, I finally broke down and told her everything. To my surprise, her eyes hardened with recognition when I mentioned Richard's name. "That sleazeball hit on every woman at my old firm," she said. "He got fired after a secretary filed a harassment claim." For the first time, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. Someone else knew Richard was bad news. Tina was indignant on my behalf, her usually perfect composure breaking as she cursed under her breath about entitled jerks who think they can get away with anything. She took my hand across the table and promised she would help however she could. Tina introduced me to her brother Sam, a paralegal at a local law firm. He listened to my story and offered to talk to one of the attorneys about taking my case pro bono. Within days, I had legal help. My lawyer, Grace Wilson, was a no-nonsense woman who specialized in domestic abuse cases. She immediately sent cease and desist letters to both Richard and Greg Mercer. She also helped me document every interaction, threat, and incident. The temporary restraining order against Mark was extended, and we filed a harassment complaint against Richard. Greg Mercer suddenly became scarce, communicating only through a property management company. I began to think we might actually get through this. Then one night, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. Someone was in our apartment. I grabbed the baseball bat and Jamie, locking us both in the bathroom while I called 911. I could hear someone ransacking the living room, getting closer to Jamie's bedroom. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on the way. The bathroom door handle started to turn. I gripped the bat, positioning myself in front of Jamie, who was crying quietly. The door burst open, and there was Mark, wild-eyed and reeking of alcohol. "You think you can keep my son from me?" he slurred, lunging forward. I swung the bat as hard as I could, hitting him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing. Jamie was screaming now. Mark came at me again, and this time I hit him in the knee. He went down just as the sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrested Mark, and this time the charges were serious: breaking and entering, violating a restraining order, attempted assault. Jamie and I spent the night at Tina's apartment, both of us too shaken to sleep. Tina set us up in her guest room, bringing us extra blankets and making hot chocolate for Jamie. Her husband Mike was kind too, offering Jamie his old handheld video game to play to keep his mind off things. They had a comfortable home in a nice neighborhood, with family photos on the walls and matching furniture sets, the kind of stable, normal life that felt impossibly out of reach for me. In the morning, Grace called with news that Mark was being held without bail due to the violation. It should have been a relief, but I knew we still weren't safe in our apartment, not with Richard and Greg Mercer still out there. Our apartment didn't feel like home anymore anyway. The broken window was boarded up with plywood, making the living room dark and depressing. There were still shards of glass we kept finding in the carpet, no matter how carefully I vacuumed. Jamie refused to sleep in his own bed, insisting on curling up next to me each night. I didn't mind. I wanted him close where I could protect him, but it was just another sign of how deeply this trauma had affected him. Greg sent a formal eviction notice the next day, citing the property damage from the break-in as a lease violation. Grace immediately filed a counter motion, arguing that the eviction was retaliatory and illegal. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. In the meantime, I was still legally entitled to stay in the apartment, but it no longer felt like home. Every noise made me jump, and Jamie was having nightmares. Sometimes he'd wake up sobbing, convinced that the bad man was coming back. I'd hold him and rock him back to sleep, promising him that I wouldn't let anyone hurt him. But privately, I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. The final straw came when Jamie found a dead rat on our doorstep with a note that said, "Rats deserve what they get." I called Grace in a panic, and she helped us move to a women's shelter that same day. It wasn't ideal, but it was secure, and had counselors on staff who could talk to Jamie. The shelter was in a converted old school building across town. We shared a room with another mother and her daughter, with just curtains separating our beds. There was a communal kitchen where residents took turns cooking, and a small playroom for the kids. It was clean but sparse, with strict rules about visitors and curfews. But for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night, knowing there was security at the door, and that Richard and Mark couldn't get to us. Mark's case was moving through the system, with a preliminary hearing set for the following month. Grace kept me updated on the legal proceedings, explaining everything in terms I could understand. She was also fighting the eviction, and had filed a complaint against Greg Mercer with the housing authority. I was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, we might get through this. One evening at the shelter, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a man named Charles, who identified himself as a former cellmate of Mark's. He spoke quickly, saying he had information I needed to hear in person. Against my better judgment, but with the shelter security guard present, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the courthouse. I was terrified it might be another trick from Richard or Mark, but something in Charles's voice sounded genuine. I arranged for Jamie to stay in the shelter's after-school program while I went to the meeting, my heart pounding the entire time. Charles turned out to be a middle-aged man with tired eyes and prison tattoos. He explained that he'd been released yesterday after serving time for check fraud. What he told me next made my skin crawl. Mark had been openly bragging in jail about how he was going to get custody of Jamie once he was out, and how his rich friends would make sure of it. Even worse, Mark had talked about his collection, and how he'd been smart enough to have backups hidden where the police wouldn't find them. Charles said he had daughters of his own and couldn't stomach it. He decided to tell me as soon as he got out. I thanked him for the information and immediately called Grace. She arranged for me to speak with the detective handling Mark's case. The detective took Charles's information and promised to follow up, but warned me that secondhand jail conversations might not be enough for additional charges. Still, it was something. I went back to the shelter feeling both sick about what I'd learned and grateful that Charles had come forward. It gave me a strange sense of hope that even in the darkest places, there were still good people willing to do the right thing. A week later, Richard Mercer was arrested. One of his ex-girlfriends finally pressed charges for stalking and harassment, and several other women came forward with similar stories. The local paper ran a small article about it, mentioning that police were investigating other potential crimes. Greg Mercer issued a statement distancing himself from his nephew, claiming he had no knowledge of Richard's personal problems. So many women had stories about Richard, stories of unwanted advances, of persistent harassment, of threats when they turned him down. It was like a dam had broken, and suddenly everyone was willing to talk about the open secret of Richard Mercer's behavior. With Richard in legal trouble of his own, the pressure from the Mercer family eased. Greg's lawyer reached out to Grace, offering to drop the eviction proceedings if I would agree not to sue for harassment. Grace countered by demanding that the bail loan be forgiven, and 3 months of rent-free living to compensate for the stress and damage. Surprisingly, Greg agreed. I later learned that with Richard's arrest, the police had obtained a warrant for his electronic devices, and found communications about pressuring me that implicated Greg. He was cutting his losses. The women's shelter connected me with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Jamie started weekly sessions to process everything that had happened. He had so many questions about his dad, and I struggled to find age-appropriate ways to explain why Mark couldn't be in our lives. The psychologist was a godsend, helping both of us navigate these impossible conversations. She gave me phrases to use when Jamie asked the hard questions, and worked with him through play therapy to express his fears and confusion. Slowly, things began to improve. I returned to work full-time, and my boss, now aware of what I'd been dealing with, was surprisingly supportive. The restraining order against Mark was made permanent, and his trial date was set. Grace believed the prosecution had a strong case, especially after the police, acting on Charles's information, found additional evidence hidden at a storage unit rented under Mark's name. I was still living in fear, but it had receded from a constant state of panic to a dull background anxiety. Jamie was starting to smile more, to play with other kids at the shelter, to sleep through the night occasionally. We were surviving, one day at a time. One day, about 2 months after the break-in, I received a letter from jail. It wasn't from Mark, but from a man named Bruno, another inmate. The letter explained that Mark had been bragging about getting revenge on me once he was out, describing graphic threats that made me physically ill. Bruno wrote that he had a sister who'd been in a similar situation, and he couldn't stand by while Mark planned to hurt another woman and child. He ended the letter by saying I shouldn't worry about Mark anymore. I showed the letter to Grace, who immediately contacted the jail. We learned that Mark had been found unconscious in the shower room the previous day with severe injuries. He survived but would remain hospitalized under guard for some time. The official investigation ruled it a prisoner dispute, with no clear culprit identified. I felt a complex mix of relief, guilt, and lingering fear. I knew violence wasn't the answer, but I couldn't deny the weight that lifted from my shoulders knowing Mark would be incapacitated for the foreseeable future. It gave us breathing room, time to strengthen the legal protections around Jamie and me, without the immediate threat of Mark's release hanging over our heads. Grace helped me file for sole custody of Jamie, using Mark's arrest, the restraining order, and his documented threats as evidence. The judge granted it without hesitation. With Richard facing multiple charges and Mark hospitalized before his own trial, the immediate danger seemed to have passed. I was finally able to sleep through the night again. I started thinking about the future again, making plans beyond just surviving the next day or week. I I enrolled Jamie in a new school closer to the shelter, where no one knew our history. He joined a soccer team and made new friends. I looked for a better job, one with more hours and better pay. I started saving every penny I could, determined to build a new life for us far from the shadows of Mark and the Mercers. 3 months after the break-in, Jamie and I moved to a different apartment in a neighboring town. It was a bit further from my job, but worth the commute to have a fresh start. The new place was smaller but brighter, with a little balcony where we set up a container garden. Jamie was slowly returning to his cheerful self, making friends at his new school and talking less about his father. We planted tomatoes and herbs in colorful pots, and Jamie checked on them every day before and after school, delighted when the first tiny green tomatoes appeared. It was healing for both of us, watching something grow and thrive under our care. One Saturday morning, there was a knock at our door. I tensed automatically, then checked the peephole. It was Charles, the former inmate who'd warned me about Mark. He looked different in clean clothes with his hair cut neatly. He apologized for showing up unannounced, but explained that he'd found my address through Grace, who had helped him connect with a re-entry program. He wanted to make sure Jamie and I were doing okay. I invited him in for coffee, and we talked for hours. He told me about his 3 daughters, who lived with their mother in another state, and his plans to rebuild his life now that he was out of prison. There was something calm and steady about him that put me at ease. Before he left, he asked if he could come by the following weekend to help fix a wobbly shelf he'd noticed in the kitchen. I surprised myself by saying yes. Charles became a regular visitor over the next few months. He found work as a mechanic and was taking night classes to get his associate's degree. Jamie adored him, especially when Charles taught him how to change a tire on my car and build a model rocket for his science project. I found myself looking forward to his visits more than I wanted to admit. We were careful, taking things very slowly. Charles was upfront about his past mistakes and his determination to stay on the right path. Grace checked him out thoroughly and found nothing concerning beyond the non-violent offense he'd already disclosed. 6 months after our first meeting, Charles asked if he could take me on a proper date. Jamie stayed with Tina, who had become like a sister to me through all the chaos. Charles took me to a simple Italian restaurant where we talked for hours about books, dreams, and second chances. It was the first time I'd truly relaxed in years. In court, Mark ultimately took a plea deal to avoid a full trial. He received a significant sentence that meant Jamie would be grown before he had any possibility of release. Richard Mercer was convicted on multiple harassment charges and sentenced to probation and community service. Greg Mercer sold most of his properties and moved to Arizona following a tax audit that I suspect was triggered by the investigation into his business practices. Charles officially asked me to be his girlfriend on Jamie's 8th birthday, after helping me throw the biggest party I could afford at the local park. Unlike Mark, he never tried to be Jamie's father, just a supportive, caring adult in his life. He respected my parenting decisions and our need for healing. 6 months later, he proposed, not with an expensive ring, but with a simple band and a promise to always be honest, supportive, and kind. We married in a small ceremony with Jamie as our best man. Charles adopted Jamie legally after we'd been married for a year, though we made sure Jamie knew about his biological father in age-appropriate ways, with the help of his therapist. Today, Jamie is 11 and thriving. He plays soccer, builds elaborate Lego creations, and wants to be a veterinarian. Charles works as a master mechanic and takes online business classes, hoping to open his own shop someday. I still work at the dental office, but I've been promoted to office manager. We bought a small house last year, with a yard for Jamie and our rescue dog, Nala. Sometimes I still wake up at night, startled by a noise or a bad dream. But now, instead of clutching a baseball bat in fear, I feel Charles's steady presence beside me, and I know we're safe. The journey from that terrifying text message to today wasn't easy or straightforward. There were court dates and setbacks, nights of fear, and days of uncertainty. But we made it through. I learned that family isn't always who you're born to, but who stands by you when the world feels like it's falling apart. And I learned that sometimes, love comes in unexpected packages, at unexpected times, like a reformed ex-con with kind eyes who just wanted to make sure a scared single mom and her son were okay. Life isn't perfect. We have bills and arguments and everyday struggles like any family, but we face them together, with honesty and without fear. And that makes all the difference in the world. Jamie still occasionally asks questions about Mark, especially as he gets older and understands more. We answer truthfully but carefully, with his therapist's guidance. Charles never pretends that Jamie's biological father didn't exist, but he shows Jamie every day what a real father should be. Last week, Jamie called Charles dad for the first time without prompting. The look on Charles's face was worth every moment of the difficult journey we took to get here. Sometimes I think about that text message that started it all, the one that sent my world spiraling into chaos. If I could go back, would I change how I responded? I don't think so. As terrible as that time was, it led us here, to safety, to Charles, to a real family built on trust and love, rather than fear and obligation. And that's worth everything.